The Forgotten Alpha's War. Evadne Vale had spent years running from something she couldn't name, hunted by a force she had never seen. But when she crossed the town line into Wolf's Hollow, the world shifted. The scent of pine and rain filled the air. The wind carried a name she had never spoken but somehow knew. And then he was there, standing at the edge of the trees, golden-eyed and waiting. "You don't remember me," he murmured, "but you were always meant to be mine." Chapter 1. The Scent of Pine and Rain. The tires of Evadne Vale's beat-up Volvo hummed a monotonous tune against the cracked asphalt, a soundtrack to her life for the past decade. Escape. Always escape. She gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, her gaze darting between the rear-view mirror and the darkening road ahead. There was nothing behind her, had been nothing for miles, and yet the feeling persisted. That prickling at the back of her neck, the icy dread that coiled in her stomach, the whisper in her blood that told her run. She was 57, her hair more silver than brown now, lines etched around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and weary miles. But the fear was eternally young, eternally relentless. She hadn't planned on stopping. A quick gas fill-up, a stale sandwich, and back on the road. That was her rhythm. Stay unseen, stay unknown, stay alive. But as she crossed the invisible boundary, a sign barely visible in the fading light proclaiming Wolf's Hollow, something shifted. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. More like a resonance. A deep thrumming that vibrated through the very chassis of her car, settling deep in her bones. The air changed. The stale, recycled air of the highway was replaced by a crisp, clean-scent pine needles, damp earth, and the sharp, invigorating tang of a recent rain. It was a scent that tugged at something buried deep within her, a memory that flickered at the edges of her consciousness like a dream half forgotten. She frowned, slowing the car. The feeling intensified, the thrumming growing stronger, and with it a name. A name she hadn't spoken, hadn't even thought, in she couldn't remember how long. Kaylin. The name rose unbidden, a whisper on the wind, a ghost of a feeling in her heart. She pulled over to the side of the road, the gravel crunching under her tires. The engine ticked as it cooled, the sound amplified in the sudden stillness. The forest pressed close on either side, tall pines forming a cathedral of shadows, their branches intertwined overhead, filtering the last remnants of the twilight. It was beautiful, undeniably so, but the beauty was laced with an undercurrent of something else. Something wild, untamed, and undeniably powerful. Evadne stepped out of the car, her joints protesting with a familiar ache. She stretched, trying to ease the stiffness that had settled in during the long drive. The air was even more potent here, the scent of pine and rain almost overwhelming. She breathed deeply, closing her eyes, letting the feeling wash over her. It was comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it felt like coming home, a home she didn't remember having. Terrifying because she knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that she was not safe here. That whatever she had been running from had finally caught up. She opened her eyes, and he was there. Standing at the edge of the woods, where the shadows were deepest, he was a silhouette against the fading light. Tall, broad-shouldered, a figure of raw power and quiet intensity. She couldn't see his face clearly, but she could feel his gaze. It was like a physical touch, a weight that settled on her, pinning her in place. Fear, raw and primal, clawed at her throat. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. Recognition. A flicker of something warm and longing. He took a step forward, moving with a grace that was both animalistic and undeniably human. The moonlight, breaking through a gap in the clouds, caught his face, illuminating features that were both strikingly handsome and subtly different. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes. God, his eyes. They were the color of molten gold, glowing with an inner light that seemed to pierce through the darkness, through her, straight to her soul. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze never leaving hers. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, filled only with the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the frantic beating of her own heart. The name, Kaelin, whispered through her mind again, this time accompanied by a flood of fragmented images, a moonlit forest, a whispered promise, a touch that burned like fire. He spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. "You don't remember me," he murmured. The words weren't a question, but a statement of fact, laced with a sadness that resonated deep within her. He took another step, closing the distance between them. The scent of him, pine and rain and something uniquely him, filled her senses, making her head spin. "But you were always meant to be mine." His words, his presence, the overwhelming feeling of fate washed over her, shattering the carefully constructed walls she had built around herself. The years of running, the years of fear, seemed to crumble away, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. She wanted to run, to scream, to fight. But she couldn't move. She could only stand there, caught in the golden gaze of the man, the wolf, who claimed to know her, who claimed her as his own, and a forgotten part of her whispered that he spoke the truth. Chapter 2. Echoes of a Forgotten Past. Evadne stared at him, her mind a chaotic swirl of fear and a disconcertingly familiar pull. His words echoed in the silence. "You were always meant to be mine." They were preposterous, insane even, and yet they resonated with a truth she couldn't deny, a truth that hummed in her very bones. She opened her mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, to deny his claim, but no words came. Her throat was dry, her tongue heavy. He watched her, his golden eyes filled with a mixture of patience and a deep, abiding sorrow that tugged at something hidden deep within her. He didn't move closer, didn't try to touch her, seemingly content to simply stand there and let her grapple with the impossible reality of his presence. The moonlight shifted, casting his face in sharper relief. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps in his late 50s, but age had only enhanced his rugged handsomeness. There were lines etched around his eyes, a testament to a life lived, a life that, for some reason, felt intimately connected to hers. Who are you?" She finally managed to whisper, the words ragged and unsteady. He tilted his head slightly, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "I am Kaelin," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent shivers down her spine. "Kaelin MacTyre. And you, Evadne, are the woman I've been waiting for a very long time." The name, spoken aloud, sent another wave of fragmented memories crashing over her. A meadow bathed in moonlight, a hand reaching for hers, a whisper of a vow always and forever. The images were fleeting, incomplete, but they were enough to make her heart ache with a longing she couldn't understand. She shook her head, trying to clear the fog that was clouding her mind. I don't understand," she said, her voice stronger now, fueled by a growing sense of desperation. "I've never seen you before in my life. I don't know you." Kaelin's smile faded, replaced by a look of profound sadness. "You do know me, Evadne. You've just forgotten. It's the curse. It steals memories, breaks bonds, leaves only shadows and echoes." "Curse? Bonds?" The words were fantastical, nonsensical, and yet they felt right. She looked around at the towering pines, at the moon hanging heavy in the sky, at the man standing before her, radiating an aura of power and mystery. The world she thought she knew, the world of logic and reason, seemed to be dissolving around her, replaced by something older, something wilder, something magical. "What curse?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He stepped closer, and this time, she didn't flinch. She couldn't. She was drawn to him, pulled by an invisible force that defied logic and reason. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her cheek. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, the subtle tremor in his fingertips. "The curse that binds us," he said, his voice low and intense. "The curse that separates us, lifetime after lifetime. The curse that was meant to keep us apart, but which, ultimately, always brings us back together." He lowered his hand, his gaze locking with hers. "You feel it, don't you? The pull? The connection? It's the soul bond, Evadne. It's unbreakable, undeniable. It's us." soul bond. The words sent a jolt of electricity through her, a shock of recognition that resonated deep within her soul. She looked into his eyes, into those pools of molten gold, and she saw truth. She saw a love that spanned lifetimes, a connection that defied time and space. She saw a past she couldn't remember, a future she couldn't imagine, and a present that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She began, but the words died in her throat. She didn't know what to say, what to believe. Her mind was reeling, her heart pounding. She was caught between two worlds, the world she knew and the world he was revealing to her. A world of curses and soul bonds, of werewolves and ancient magic. He seemed to understand her confusion, her fear. He offered her a small, reassuring smile. "It's a lot to take in, I know," he said gently. "But you're not alone. I'm here, and I'll help you remember. I'll help you understand." He gestured towards the town, hidden just beyond the trees.
"Come," he said.
"Come to Wolf's Hollow. It's time you came home." Home. The word, spoken by him, sent a wave of longing through her, a longing so intense it brought tears to her eyes. She looked at him, at the man who claimed to be her soulmate, the man who held the key to her forgotten past. And despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, she knew she had to follow him. She had to trust him. She had to find out if what he said was true. Because deep down, in the deepest recesses of her heart, she knew that he was her only hope. Her only chance to finally stop running. Her only chance to finally find peace. Chapter 3. The Wolf at the Edge of the Woods. Evadne hesitated for only a moment, her gaze flicking between Kaelin's golden eyes and the dark, inviting depths of Wolf's Hollow. The rational part of her screamed at her to run, to get back in her car and drive as far away from this place, from this man, as possible. But the other part, the part that had been awakened by his touch, by his words, by the undeniable pull that connected them, urged her forward. How can I trust you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. It was a valid question, a necessary one. She had spent years trusting no one, relying only on herself. To suddenly surrender that control, to place her faith in a stranger, a man who claimed to be a werewolf, was a leap of faith she wasn't sure she was ready to make. Kaelin's expression softened, his gaze filled with understanding and a hint of sadness. "You don't have to trust me completely, Evadne," he said gently. "Not yet. But trust your instincts. Trust the feeling that brought you here. Trust the connection you feel between us." He held out his hand, palm up, an offering of trust, of protection. It was a large hand, calloused and strong, but his touch, when she had felt the brief brush of his fingers against her cheek earlier, had been surprisingly gentle. She looked at his hand, then back at his face, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of malice. But she found only sincerity, only a deep, abiding love that seemed to reach out and envelop her. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and placed her hand in his. The moment their skin made contact, a jolt of energy surged through her, a powerful wave of warmth and recognition. It was like coming home, like finding a missing piece of herself she hadn't even realized was gone. His fingers closed around hers, his grip strong and reassuring. The fear that had been gnawing at her began to recede, replaced by a growing sense of peace. "Come," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Let me show you." He turned and began to walk towards the town, his hand still firmly clasped in hers. She followed, her steps hesitant at first, then growing stronger with each passing moment. The forest, which had seemed so menacing before, now felt welcoming. The scent of pine and rain was intoxicating, the rustling of the leaves a soothing lullaby. As they walked, Kaelin began to tell her about Wolf's Hollow. He spoke of a community of werewolves, living in harmony with nature, hidden away from the prying eyes of the human world. He spoke of ancient traditions, of powerful magic, of a bond that connected them all. He spoke of his role as Alpha, the leader of the pack, responsible for their safety and well-being. "We are different here, Evadne," he explained. "We embrace our wolf nature. We live by the cycles of the moon. We honor the ancient ways. But we are not monsters. We are protectors. We guard the balance between the human world and the supernatural. She listened, her mind struggling to reconcile his words with everything she thought she knew about the world. Werewolves, magic, it all sounded like something out of a fairy tale. And yet, she couldn't deny the evidence of her own senses, the feeling of his hand in hers, the undeniable pull that drew her closer to him with every step. As they neared the edge of the woods, the trees began to thin, revealing a glimpse of the town nestled in the valley below. It was a small town, quaint and picturesque, with charming houses and cobblestone streets. Smoke curled from chimneys, lights twinkled in windows, and the faint sound of laughter drifted on the evening breeze. It looked normal. Deceptively so. Most of the humans who live here are aware, Kaylin explained, sensing her unspoken question. They know about us and they accept us. We've lived in harmony with them for generations. They are part of our extended family. They emerged from the woods, standing on a small rise overlooking the town. The full moon, now high in the sky, bathed the scene in a silvery glow. It was a breathtaking sight, and for the first time in a long time, Evadne felt a flicker of hope. Kaylin turned to her, his golden eyes searching hers. "This is your home, Evadne," he said softly. "This is where you belong. With me. With us." She looked at him, at the town, at the moonlit sky. And she knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that he was right. She had spent years running, searching for something she couldn't name. And now, here, in this strange, magical place, with this man who claimed to be her soulmate, she had finally found it. She had found home. But even as she felt that sense of belonging, a shadow of doubt lingered. The curse he had spoken of, the danger that had followed her for so long, it couldn't be that easy. Could it? Chapter 4. Whispers of Wolf's Hollow. The walk down into Wolf's Hollow was filled with a strange mixture of anticipation and trepidation. Evadne's hand remained firmly clasped in Kaylin's, the warmth of his touch a constant reassurance against the growing unease that fluttered in her stomach. The town, which had seemed so idyllic from afar, now felt charged. There was an energy here, a palpable sense of something ancient and powerful that hummed beneath the surface of everyday life. The houses they passed were charming, old-fashioned structures with gabled roofs and flower-filled window boxes. But as they drew closer, Evadne noticed subtle details that hinted at the town's true nature. Wrought iron gates adorned with wolf motifs, carved wooden doors depicting scenes of moonlit hunts, and the occasional, almost imperceptible, flash of golden eyes watching them from darkened windows. People stopped to stare as they passed, their gazes curious but not unfriendly. There were whispers, hushed conversations that ceased abruptly as Kaylin and Evadne approached. She could feel their eyes on her, assessing, evaluating. It was unnerving, but Kaylin's presence beside her, his calm strength, kept her fear at bay. "They know who you are," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Or rather, they know what you are. They've been expecting you." "Expecting me?" Evadne asked, her brow furrowed. "But how?" He gave her a small, enigmatic smile. "The alpha's mate is always anticipated," he said. "Especially one who has been lost for so long." They reached the center of town, a small square dominated by a large, ancient oak tree. Its branches, thick and gnarled, reached up towards the sky like the arms of a giant, its leaves rustling in the night breeze. A stone fountain stood in the center of the square, its water shimmering in the moonlight. Several people were gathered there, talking and laughing, but they fell silent as Kaylin and Evadne approached. A woman stepped forward, her silver hair braided down her back, her eyes a striking shade of emerald green. She was tall and regal, with an air of authority that commanded respect. Evadne recognized her instantly, not from any specific memory, but from a deep, instinctive knowing. This was Moira, Kaylin's second in command, the beta of the pack. "Kaylin," Moira said, her voice warm and welcoming. She nodded towards Evadne, her gaze curious but respectful. "And you must be Evadne. We've been waiting for you." Evadne felt a blush rise to her cheeks. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, and the scrutiny of the pack, even a friendly one, was unsettling. She tightened her grip on Kalen's hand, drawing strength from his presence. "Moira," Kalen said, his voice filled with affection. "This is Evadne. She doesn't remember much. Yet. The curse is still strong." Moira's expression softened with understanding. "It will come back," she said, her voice filled with reassurance. "Time and patience. And the love of your mate." She stepped closer to Evadne, her green eyes searching hers. "Welcome home, Evadne," she said softly. "We are glad to have you." The sincerity in her voice, the warmth in her eyes, touched Evadne deeply. She felt a lump form in her throat, tears pricking at her eyes. She had been alone for so long, so fiercely independent, that the simple act of being welcomed, of being accepted, was overwhelming. Thank you," she managed to whisper, her voice choked with emotion. The other members of the pack began to approach, offering words of welcome, smiles of greeting. They were a diverse group, ranging in age from young children to elderly adults, but they all shared a common bond, a sense of belonging that was palpable. Evadne felt herself being drawn into their circle, enveloped in their warmth and acceptance. Kalen remained by her side, his hand still firmly clasped in hers, his presence a constant source of comfort and support. He introduced her to each member of the pack, sharing a brief story or anecdote about each one, making her feel like she was already a part of their community. As the evening progressed, Evadne began to relax, to let go of some of her fear and apprehension. She found herself laughing at their jokes, sharing stories of her own carefully edited, of course, to omit any mention of her years on the run, and even accepting a glass of homemade elderflower wine from a kind, elderly woman named Alara. But even as she enjoyed the warmth and camaraderie of the pack, a part of her remained on guard. The curse Kalen had spoken of the danger that had followed her for so long it was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. She couldn't afford to let her guard down completely. Not yet. Not until she knew the truth about her past, about the curse, about the man who claimed to be her soulmate. And as she looked across the square at Kalen, his golden eyes watching her with a mixture of love and concern, she knew that her journey had only just begun. The feeling that something very significant was about to happen was intense. The whispers in the wind had stopped, she realized. But not the ones in her heart. Chapter 5. A Touch That Awakens. The night air grew cooler, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wood smoke and the distant howls of wolves, a sound that, surprisingly, didn't frighten Evadne. It felt natural, a part of the rhythm of this place, of this life she was slowly, hesitantly, stepping into. The gathering in the square began to disperse, families drifting back to their homes, leaving Evadne and Kalen alone beneath the ancient oak. He turned to her, his golden eyes searching hers in the moonlight. "Are you tired?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. She was. Exhausted, in fact. The emotional turmoil of the day, the revelation of a past she couldn't remember, the overwhelming sense of belonging had taken its toll. But she wasn't ready to be alone, not yet. She was still afraid, still uncertain, still clinging to his presence as a lifeline. "A little," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. But he understood. He always seemed to understand, reading her unspoken thoughts, her hidden fears. "Come," he said, gently tugging her hand. "I'll take you to my home. It's not far." His home was a large, stone house on the edge of town, nestled against the backdrop of the forest. It was old, like everything else in Wolf's Hollow, but well-maintained, with a sense of timeless elegance. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and the windows glowed with warm, inviting light. As they approached, Evadne noticed a detail she hadn't seen before. Carved into the wooden lintel above the front door was a single, intricate symbol, a wolf's head intertwined with a crescent moon. It was the same symbol she had seen flickering in her fragmented memories, the same symbol that seemed to be calling to her. "What does it mean?" she asked, pointing to the carving. Kalen followed her gaze, his expression softening. It's the symbol of our bond, he said. The wolf represents me. The moon represents you. It signifies our connection, our unity, our destiny. He opened the door, and the scent of pine and wood smoke, mingled with a subtle, musky scent that was uniquely him, washed over her. The interior of the house was warm and inviting, with exposed wooden beams, a large stone fireplace, and comfortable, worn furniture. It felt lived in, loved, a true home. He led her through the main room, towards a staircase that led to the upper floor. I've prepared a room for you, he said. It was always meant to be yours. The room was at the end of a long hallway, overlooking the forest. It was large and airy, with a four-poster bed draped in soft, white linens, a cozy sitting area with a fireplace, and a large window that offered a breathtaking view of the moonlit woods. It was beautiful, undeniably so, but it also felt charged. There was an energy here, a sense of anticipation, that made her heart beat faster. Kaelin lit a fire in the hearth, the flames casting a warm, flickering glow over the room. He turned to her, his golden eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and something else. Something that made her breath catch in her throat. I know this is a lot to take in, he said softly. And I know you're still afraid. But I promise you, Evadne, I will never hurt you. I will always protect you. You are safe here. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her cheek. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. She met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. The air between them crackled with an almost unbearable tension. He traced the line of her cheekbone with his fingertip, his touch feather light, sending a wave of heat through her. She closed her eyes, savoring the sensation, the feeling of his touch awakening something deep within her, something that had been dormant for so long. You feel it, don't you? He whispered, his voice husky with emotion. The connection? The pull? It's always been there, Evadne. Even when you didn't remember, it was there. She opened her eyes, her gaze locking with his. She did feel it, the undeniable pull, the magnetic force that drew her to him, that made her want to lean into his touch, to lose herself in his embrace. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and inevitable. He lowered his hand, his gaze never leaving hers. Sleep, he said softly. Rest. We'll talk more in the morning. He turned to leave, but she stopped him, her hand reaching out to grasp his arm. Kaelin, she whispered, her voice trembling. He turned back to her, his eyes questioning. She didn't know what to say, what to ask. She only knew that she didn't want him to leave. Not yet. She needed him, his presence, his strength, his love. He seemed to understand. He took a step closer, closing the distance between them. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. I'm here, Evadne, he whispered. I'm always here. And then, he leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a passionate, demanding kiss. It was soft, gentle, a tentative exploration, a promise of something more. But it was enough. It was enough to shatter the last of her defenses, to break down the walls she had built around her heart. It was enough to awaken the sleeping wolf within her, to ignite the fire that had been smoldering for so long. It was enough to make her remember. Not everything. Not yet. But enough to know that he was telling the truth. That they were connected, bound by a love that spanned lifetimes. That she was home. The image of a silver ring on her hand, identical to one on his, flashed in her mind. A memory, powerful and real. Where was that ring now? Chapter 6. The Mark of the Moon. The kiss lingered, a sweet, tender connection that sent a wave of warmth spreading through Evadne's body, chasing away the lingering chill of fear and uncertainty. When Kaelin finally drew back, his golden eyes were filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache. He brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead, his touch lingering. Sleep now, Evadne, he murmured, his voice husky with emotion. We have all the time in the world. He turned and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Evadne stood there for a long moment, her fingers tracing the outline of her lips, still tingling from his kiss. The memory of the silver ring, identical to one he wore, pulsed in her mind. It felt significant, a key to unlocking more of her fragmented past. She walked over to the window, gazing out at the moonlit forest. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow over the landscape, and she felt a strange pull, a connection to the celestial body that she couldn't explain. It was as if the moon itself was calling to her, whispering secrets she couldn't quite understand. As she stared at the moon, she noticed something on her left hand, something she hadn't seen before. A faint, silvery mark on her ring finger, in the exact shape of a crescent moon. It was barely visible, almost like a faded scar, but it was undeniably there. She gasped, her fingers instinctively touching the mark. It was cool to the touch, and as she traced its outline, a jolt of energy surged through her, bringing with it another wave of fragmented memories. A moonlit ceremony, a whispered vow, a silver ring placed on her finger always and forever. The ring. She had to find it. It was the key, she knew, to unlocking her past, to understanding the curse, to reclaiming the life that had been stolen from her. She turned away from the window, her mind racing. Where would she have hidden it? Somewhere safe, somewhere secret, somewhere familiar. Her gaze fell on the antique wooden chest at the foot of the bed. It was old, beautifully carved, with a heavy, ornate lock. It looked familiar. She felt a pull towards it, a sense of knowing. She knelt down in front of the chest, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings. She tried the lock, but it was, as expected, fastened tight. She needed a key, or something else. She closed her eyes, focusing on the feeling, on the memory of the ring, on the pull towards the chest. She reached out, her hand hovering over the lock. And then, she did something she didn't understand, something that felt instinctive, natural. She whispered a word in a language she didn't recognize, but which flowed from her lips as easily as if she had spoken it 1,000 times before. Oskli. The lock clicked open. Evadne stared at the chest, her heart pounding in her chest. She had done that. She had spoken a word of magic. And it had worked. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted the lid of the chest. The scent of dried lavender and old parchment wafted up, filling the room. Inside, nestled among layers of soft linen, were several items that seemed to leap out at her, sparking flashes of recognition. A worn leather-bound journal, its pages filled with elegant handwriting. A silver locket containing a miniature portrait of a younger, happier Evadne. And there, at the very bottom of the chest, wrapped in a piece of faded velvet, was the ring. It was a simple silver band, intricately carved with the same symbol as the one above Kaelin's door, a wolf's head intertwined with a crescent moon. As she picked it up, she felt a surge of emotion, a wave of love and loss and longing. This was it. This was the proof, the tangible link to her forgotten past. She slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. As it settled into place, she felt another jolt of energy, a powerful surge that made her gasp. The room seemed to spin, the moonlight intensified, and the fragmented memories that had been haunting her suddenly coalesced, forming a coherent picture. She remembered. She remembered everything. She remembered her life with Kaelin, their love, their bond, their pact. She remembered the curse, the ancient enemy that had sought to destroy them, the ritual that had been performed to protect her, to erase her memory and send her away, to keep her safe until the time was right for her to return. She remembered the pain of separation, the agony of loss, the years of running, of hiding, of living in fear. She remembered it all. And as the memories flooded back, so did the emotions. The love, the grief, the anger, the fear. It was overwhelming, a tidal wave that threatened to drown her. She clutched the ring, her knuckles white, her body trembling. She was Evadne MacTyre, the Alpha's mate, the Luna of the Wolf's Hollow Pack. She was home, and she was ready to fight. But a new fear crept in. How long had this ritual kept her away? How much had Kaelin changed? And the biggest question of all, did he still love her as he once had? Chapter 7. Shadows of the Hunt. The flood of recovered memories left Evadne breathless, reeling. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the silver ring a tangible weight on her finger, a constant reminder of the life that had been stolen from her and the love that had endured through it all. The questions that had surfaced about Kaylin, about the years they had lost, about the curse itself swirled in her mind, a turbulent mix of hope and fear. She rose and began to pace the room, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet, a counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of her heart. She needed to see Kaylin, to talk to him, to understand what had happened in her absence. But a nagging sense of unease held her back. The curse had been cast to protect her, to hide her from an ancient enemy. Had that enemy been vanquished? Or was the danger still present, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike? As if in answer to her unspoken question, a low growl echoed from the forest below, a sound filled with menace and warning. Evadne froze, her senses on high alert. It wasn't the familiar, comforting howl of Kaylin's pack. This was different, darker, more aggressive. She rushed to the window, peering out into the moonlit night. At first she saw nothing, but then a flicker of movement caught her eye. Shadows, moving swiftly and silently through the trees, their forms indistinct, their intentions unclear. But Evadne knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they were not friendly. They were hunters. The realization sent a jolt of fear through her, a fear that was both primal and deeply personal. She had been hunted before, for years, always one step ahead of an unseen enemy. She had thought she was safe here, in Wolf's Hollow, protected by Kaylin and his pack. But the shadows in the forest proved her wrong. She turned away from the window, her mind racing. She needed to warn Kaylin, to alert the pack. But how? She didn't know the layout of the house, the location of the other pack members, the best way to raise the alarm. She grabbed the leather-bound journal from the chest, her fingers fumbling with the clasp. She remembered writing in it, pouring out her thoughts and feelings, recording the details of her life, her love for Kaylin, her fears about the curse. Perhaps there was something in it, some clue, some information that could help her now. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the elegant handwriting, searching for anything that might be relevant. She found entries about the pack's defenses, about secret tunnels and hidden pathways, about a warning system that used a series of strategically placed bells throughout the town. The bells. That was it. She needed to find a bell, to ring the alarm, to warn the pack of the impending danger. She closed the journal, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to move quickly, silently. The hunters were close, she could feel it. She had to reach a bell before they reached her. She slipped out of the room, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. The house was dark and silent, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the windows. She moved cautiously, her senses on high alert, listening for any sound that might betray the hunter's presence. She reached the main staircase, her hand gripping the banister. She paused, listening. Silence. She took a deep breath and began to descend, her steps slow and deliberate. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she heard a sound. A faint scratching coming from the front door. The hunters. They were trying to get in. Evadne froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She was trapped. The front door was the most obvious way out, but it was also the most dangerous. She needed another way, a secret way, a way that only she and Kaylin knew. She remembered a passage, mentioned briefly in her journal, a hidden tunnel that led from the cellar to the old oak tree in the town square. It was a long shot, but it was her only hope. She turned and raced towards the back of the house, towards the kitchen, towards the cellar door. She had to reach the tunnel, to reach the square, to ring the bell. She had to warn Kaylin. She had to save her pack. She had to save herself. The scratching at the door grew louder, more insistent, accompanied now by a low, guttural growl. They were getting closer. And Evadne knew that time was running out. Chapter 8. The Curse of Binding Souls. The cellar door was tucked away in a dark corner of the kitchen, almost hidden behind a large, wooden pantry. Evadne fumbled with the latch, her hands shaking, her heart pounding in her chest. The scratching at the front door had stopped, replaced by a more ominous sound, the splintering of wood. They were breaking in. She finally managed to open the cellar door, revealing a steep, narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air that wafted up was cold and damp, carrying the scent of earth and something else. Something ancient and powerful, a residue of the magic that had been used to create the hidden tunnel. She hesitated for only a moment, then plunged down the stairs, pulling the door shut behind her. The darkness was complete, absolute, and for a moment, she felt a wave of panic. She was trapped, alone, in the dark, with the hunters breaking into the house above. But then, she remembered Kalen's words, "Trust your instincts." She closed her eyes, focusing on the feeling, on the connection to the magic that permeated this place. She reached out, her hand brushing against the cold, stone wall, and she felt it. A faint vibration, a subtle energy that pulsed beneath her fingertips. She followed the vibration, her hand guiding her along the wall, down the narrow passageway. The air grew colder, the scent of earth stronger, but she didn't stop. She had to reach the tunnel, to reach the square, to warn the pack. As she walked, she began to hear a faint sound, a whispering voice that seemed to echo through the darkness. It was a woman's voice, ancient and powerful, speaking in the same language she had used to open the chest. Aisling, the voice was calling her name, guiding her, urging her forward. Evadne didn't understand the words, but she understood the intent. She was not alone. The magic of the tunnel, the spirit of the woman who had created it, was with her. The passageway began to widen, the darkness to lessen. Ahead, she saw a faint glimmer of light, the entrance to the tunnel. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding with anticipation. She reached the tunnel and stepped into a large, circular chamber. The walls were lined with ancient stones, carved with intricate symbols and runes. In the center of the chamber, a pool of water shimmered in the faint light filtering down from above. The whispering voice spoke again, louder this time, clearer.
Ante abikailte, tasiarais. An malat, tasegriste.
ACH ton contort fos and rith, Aisling rith. Evadne didn't understand the words, but she understood the meaning. The one who is lost is back. The curse, it is broken. But the danger is still there. Run. Evadne, run. She looked around the chamber, searching for the exit, for the continuation of the tunnel. She saw it, a narrow opening in the far wall, barely visible in the shadows. She started towards it, but then she stopped. She looked back at the pool of water, at the shimmering surface. She felt a pull towards it, a sense of knowing. She remembered something from her journal, a passage about the pool, about its power, about its connection to the curse. She knelt down beside the pool, her fingers tracing the cold, stone edge. She looked into the water, and saw not her own reflection, but a vision of the past, of the night the curse was cast. She saw herself, younger, more vulnerable, standing before a circle of werewolves, her hand clasped in Kalen's. She saw the ancient enemy, a powerful sorceress with eyes of ice and a heart filled with hatred. She saw the ritual, the chanting, the magic, the sacrifice. She saw Kalen, his face contorted with grief and determination, making the ultimate sacrifice, sending her away, erasing her memory, to protect her from the sorceress's wrath. She saw the sorceress, her face twisted in a mask of fury, vowing revenge, promising to return, to destroy everything Kalen held dear. The vision faded, leaving Evadne gasping for breath, her body trembling. She understood now. The curse was not just about separating her from Kalen. It was about binding their souls, twisting their love, turning it into a weapon of destruction. The sorceress had not been defeated. She had merely been delayed. And now she was back. The hunters were not just hunting Evadne. They were hunting Kalen, hunting the pack, hunting the power that resided in Wolf's Hollow. They were agents of the sorceress, sent to finish what she had started so long ago. Evadne rose to her feet, her determination renewed. She had to reach Kalen, to warn him, to fight by his side. She had to break the curse, once and for all. She had to defeat the sorceress and reclaim her life, her love, her destiny. She wouldn't run. She knew, looking into that shimmering pool, that she had to fight, even if winning meant making a terrible sacrifice of her own. Chapter 9. Hidden Truths in Candlelight. Evadne emerged from the tunnel into the cool night air, the scent of pine and damp earth a welcome contrast to the musty confines of the underground passage. She found herself in a small, overgrown garden behind the town hall, a short distance from the central square and the ancient oak. The moon, still high in the sky, cast long shadows, obscuring her movements as she made her way towards the front of the building. She could hear voices, the murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter. The pack was still unaware of the danger, still going about their nightly routines. She had to reach the bell, to warn them before it was too late. She crept along the side of the building, her senses on high alert, listening for any sign of the hunters. She reached the corner and peered cautiously around the edge. The square was bathed in moonlight, the fountain shimmering in the center, the oak tree looming large and silent. And there, hanging from a sturdy branch of the oak, was the bell. It was large, made of heavy bronze, with a long rope dangling down within easy reach. Evadne took a deep breath, preparing to make a dash for it.
But then she stopped.
She heard a sound, a faint rustling, coming from the shadows beneath the oak. She strained her eyes, trying to see through the darkness. And then she saw them. Two figures, cloaked and hooded, standing silently beneath the tree, their faces hidden, their hands resting on the hilts of swords. They were guarding the bell. Evadne's heart sank. She couldn't reach the bell without alerting the guards, and she couldn't fight them alone. She needed help. She needed Kaelin. She retreated back into the shadows, her mind racing. She had to find another way to warn the pack, another way to reach Kaelin. She remembered Moira, Kaelin's beta, her strength, her wisdom, her loyalty. If she could reach Moira, she could tell her about the hunters, about the sorceress, about the danger that threatened them all. She knew where Moira lived, in a small cottage near the edge of town, overlooking the river. It was a risky move, exposing herself in the open, but she had no other choice. She had to try. She slipped away from the town hall, moving swiftly and silently through the darkened streets, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the main thoroughfares. She reached Moira's cottage and saw a light flickering in the window. She was home. Evadne approached cautiously, her hand resting on the hilt of a small dagger she had found in the chest, a weapon she had carried long ago, a weapon she now remembered how to use. She reached the door and knocked softly. A moment later, the door opened, and Moira stood there, her emerald eyes widening in surprise.
Evadne?
She said, her voice filled with concern.
What is it?
What's wrong? Evadne quickly explained everything, her words tumbling out in a rush, her voice trembling with urgency. She told Moira about the hunters, about the sorceress, about the vision in the pool, about the danger that threatened the pack. Moira listened intently, her expression growing increasingly grave. When Evadne had finished, Moira nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "We must warn Kaelin," she said. "And the others. We must prepare to fight." She led Evadne inside the cottage, a small, cozy space filled with books and herbs and the scent of wood smoke. She lit a few more candles, casting a warm, flickering glow over the room. She went to a small, wooden cabinet and took out a long, curved horn. "This will alert the pack," she explained. "It's a signal we use in times of danger. It will bring them to the square, ready to fight." She stepped outside and blew a long, mournful blast on the horn. The sound echoed through the night, a clear, unmistakable warning. Evadne felt a surge of relief. The pack would be alerted. They would be ready. But as the sound of the horn faded, a new sound reached their ears. A chilling, high-pitched laugh, coming from the direction of the square. The sorceress. She was here. Moira turned to Evadne, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination.
"She knows," she said.
"She knows you're back. She knows the curse is broken." She gripped Evadne's arm, her fingers digging into her flesh. "You must find Kalen," she said urgently. "He's the only one who can stop her. He's the only one who can protect you." Evadne nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew Moira was right. She had to find Kalen. She had to face the sorceress. She had to end this, once and for all. But as they stood there, the candles flickered and almost died, the shadows lengthening and coalescing. This was powerful magic at work, and Evadne realized that finding Kalen wouldn't be as simple as it seemed. The image in the pool had not shown where he was that night. Chapter 10. The Price of Protection. The chilling laughter echoed again, closer this time, sending a shiver of dread down Evadne's spine. The candles in Moira's cottage flickered violently, threatening to extinguish, plunging them into darkness. The air grew heavy, charged with a malevolent energy that pressed down on them, making it difficult to breathe. "She's powerful," Moira said, her voice tight with tension. "More powerful than we anticipated." She gripped the horn tighter, her knuckles white. "I'll gather the pack. You find Kalen. He's likely at the council hall, reviewing the old texts. He's been searching for a way to break the curse permanently. Ever since you were taken." The council hall. Evadne remembered it vaguely, a large, stone building near the edge of the forest, used for pack meetings and ceremonies. It was a place of power, a place of ancient knowledge, a place where Kalen might be able to find the answers he sought. "Go," Moira urged, pushing her towards the door. "I'll hold them off as long as I can." Evadne hesitated, her gaze flickering between Moira's determined face and the darkened doorway. She didn't want to leave her alone, to face the sorceress and her hunters without backup. But she knew Moira was right. Kalen was the key. She had to reach him. "Be careful," she said, her voice trembling. Moira offered her a small, grim smile. "You too, Luna," she said, using Evadne's rightful title for the first time. The word, the acknowledgement, sent a surge of strength through her. Evadne slipped out of the cottage and into the night, the chilling laughter echoing in her ears. She ran, keeping to the shadows, her senses on high alert. The streets were deserted, the houses dark and silent. The pack was gathering, preparing to fight, but the sorceress was already here, her presence felt in the oppressive air, in the flickering shadows, in the growing sense of dread. She reached the council hall, a large, imposing structure made of gray stone, with tall, arched windows and a heavy, wooden door. The windows were dark, but she could hear movement inside, the rustling of papers, the murmur of voices. Kalen was here. She tried the door, but it was locked. She pounded on the wood, her heart pounding in her chest.
"Kalen," she cried.
"It's me. It's Evadne." A moment later, the door swung open, and Kalen stood there, his golden eyes widening in surprise and something else. Something that looked like relief, mixed with a profound sadness. "Evadne?" he said, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "Do you remember?" She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I remember everything," she said. "The curse the sorceress, she's here, Kalen. She's attacking the pack." His expression hardened, his eyes flashing with anger. He pulled her inside, slamming the door shut behind her. "I know," he said. "I felt her presence. I've been trying to find a way to..." He stopped, his gaze locking with hers. He reached out, his hands cupping her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "You're safe," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and awe. "You're really here." He leaned down and kissed her, a passionate, desperate kiss that spoke of years of longing, of love and loss and reunion. Evadne responded with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his. It was a kiss that erased the years, that bridged the gap between them, that reaffirmed their bond. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their hearts pounding in unison. But the urgency of the situation quickly returned. "We don't have much time," Evadne said. "She's powerful, Kalen. More powerful than before." He nodded, his expression grim. "I know. I've been studying the ancient texts, trying to find a way to defeat her. There's a ritual, a counter-curse, but it requires a sacrifice. Evadne's blood ran cold. A sacrifice? She asked, her voice trembling. What kind of sacrifice? Kaelin hesitated, his gaze avoiding hers. A life, he said softly. The life of the one who cast the original curse. Or the life of the one who was cursed. Evadne stared at him, her mind reeling. The sorceress or her. Those were the options. A life for a life. It was a cruel, barbaric choice, but she knew, with a sinking certainty, that it was the only way. She looked at Kaelin, at the man she loved, the man who had sacrificed so much to protect her. She saw the pain in his eyes, the weight of the burden he carried. She knew what she had to do. I'll do it, she said, her voice firm, resolute. I'll make the sacrifice. He shook his head violently, his eyes flashing.
No.
He would not even consider it. But her mind was already racing ahead to what she knew she needed to prepare for. Chapter 11. Running from Destiny.
No.
Kaelin's voice was a raw, guttural cry, his hands tightening on her arms, his grip almost painful. I won't let you. There has to be another way. His eyes, usually pools of molten gold, were now ablaze with a fierce, protective fire. Evadne saw the pain in them, the desperation, the refusal to accept the inevitable. But she also saw the love, the unwavering devotion that had sustained them through the years, through the curse, through the separation. Kaelin, she said softly, cupping his face in her hands, her thumbs gently stroking his cheeks. There is no other way. We both know it. The texts are clear. A life for a life. Damn the texts. He roared, his voice echoing through the council hall. He pulled away from her, pacing the room like a caged animal, his frustration and anger palpable. There has to be something else, some loophole, some other way to break this curse. He ran his hands through his hair, his shoulders slumping with the weight of the burden he carried. Evadne watched him, her heart aching for his pain, for his struggle. She knew how much he had sacrificed to protect her, how much he had suffered in her absence. She couldn't bear to see him like this, broken and defeated. Kaelin, she said again, her voice firm, resolute. Look at me. He stopped pacing, his gaze locking with hers. She saw the turmoil in his eyes, the battle raging within him. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them. I'm not afraid, she said. I've spent years running, hiding, living in fear. But I'm not running anymore. I'm here. With you. And I'm ready to face whatever comes. She reached out and took his hands, her fingers intertwining with his. This curse, it's not just about us, she said. It's about the pack, about Wolf's Hollow, about the balance between the human world and the supernatural. We have a responsibility to protect them, to protect the innocent. She squeezed his hands, her gaze unwavering. I love you, Kaelin, she said. More than words can say. And I know you love me. But sometimes, love means making sacrifices. Sometimes love means letting go. His eyes filled with tears, his body trembling. He knew she was right. He knew there was no other way. But the thought of losing her, of sacrificing her, was unbearable. I can't, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I can't lose you again. You won't lose me, she said, her voice filled with a conviction she didn't quite feel. I'll always be with you. In your heart. In your memories. In the wind that whispers through the trees. In the moon that shines in the sky. I'll always be here. She leaned in and kissed him, a tender, loving kiss that was filled with both sorrow and acceptance. It was a goodbye kiss, a farewell kiss, a kiss that sealed their fate. When they broke apart, Evadne turned and walked towards the door. Where are you going? Kaelin asked, his voice filled with panic. To the clearing, she said, her voice calm, resolute. To the place where the curse was cast. It's the only place where it can be broken. She knew the clearing she spoke of, a secluded spot deep in the forest, a place of ancient power, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. It was the place where she had been sent away, the place where she would now return, to make the ultimate sacrifice. "No," Kalen said, his voice rising in desperation. "I'm going with you. I won't let you face this alone." Evadne shook her head. "You can't," she said. "You have to stay here. You have to protect the pack. You're the alpha. They need you." She reached the door, her hand on the latch. She turned back to face him, her eyes filled with love and determination. "I love you, Kalen McTire," she said. "Always and forever." And then, before he could stop her, she slipped out of the council hall and into the night, running towards the forest, towards the clearing, towards her destiny. Leaving him behind broke her heart more completely than the curse ever had. Chapter 12. The Gathering Storm. Evadne ran through the moonlit forest, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees loomed around her, tall and silent witnesses to her desperate flight. The scent of pine and damp earth filled her nostrils, a familiar comfort in the midst of the growing terror. She could feel the sorceress's presence, a dark, malevolent energy that pulsed through the forest, growing stronger with every step she took towards the clearing. She knew Kalen would follow her. Despite her plea, despite her insistence that he stay and protect the pack, she knew he wouldn't let her face this alone. He was her mate, her soulmate, bound to her by a love that transcended time and space. He would come, but she couldn't wait for him. She had to reach the clearing, to prepare, to be ready when the sorceress arrived. She had to buy time, time for Kalen, time for the pack, time for the ritual that would end the curse once and for all. As she ran, she remembered the details of the ritual, the words, the gestures, the ingredients. She had read about it in her journal, in the ancient texts, in the fragmented memories that had flooded back to her. It was a dangerous ritual, a powerful counter-curse that required precise timing, unwavering focus, and the ultimate sacrifice. She reached the clearing, a circular space bathed in moonlight, surrounded by towering pines. The air here was thick with magic, with a sense of ancient power, with the lingering echoes of the curse that had been cast so long ago. In the center of the clearing, a large, flat stone served as an altar, its surface worn smooth by time and ritual. Evadne approached the altar, her steps slow and deliberate. She could feel the sorceress's presence, drawing closer, like a gathering storm, ready to unleash its fury. She had to hurry. She began to gather the ingredients she needed, drawing on her fragmented memories, on the knowledge that had been passed down through generations of werewolves. She found wild herbs growing at the edge of the clearing, their leaves shimmering in the moonlight. She collected stones, smooth and cool to the touch, imbued with the energy of the earth. She found a fallen branch, its wood dry and brittle, perfect for kindling a fire. She arranged the ingredients on the altar, her hands moving with a practiced grace, her mind focused on the task at hand. She chanted the words of the ritual, her voice low and steady, the ancient language flowing from her lips as if she had spoken it 1,000 times before. As she chanted, she felt a shift in the energy around her. The air grew colder, the shadows deepened, the moonlight intensified. The veil between worlds was thinning, the barrier between the human realm and the supernatural weakening. The sorceress was coming. And then she heard it. A chilling, high-pitched laugh, echoing through the trees, closer than ever before. Evadne stopped chanting, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned, her gaze sweeping the edge of the clearing, searching for the source of the sound. And then she saw her. The sorceress stepped out of the shadows, her form tall and imposing, her eyes glowing with an icy, malevolent light. She was dressed in flowing black robes, her silver hair cascading down her back, her face twisted in a mask of hatred and triumph. "You," Evadne said, her voice trembling, but filled with a newfound strength. "You came back." The sorceress smiled, a cruel, mocking smile that sent a shiver of dread down Evadne's spine. "Of course, I came back," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "I promised I would, didn't I? I promised to destroy everything your precious alpha holds dear." She took a step closer, her eyes fixed on Evadne. And you are the key, she said. The final piece of the puzzle. The sacrifice that will break the bond. Once and for all. Evadne stood her ground, her chin lifted, her eyes blazing with defiance. I'm not afraid of you, she said. The sorceress laughed again, a chilling sound that echoed through the clearing. You should be, she said. You should be very afraid. She raised her hand, and a ball of dark energy formed in her palm, crackling with power. Evadne knew she was about to attack. She had to be ready. She had to fight. But even as she braced herself for the inevitable, she heard a sound behind her. A familiar growl, a powerful roar that shook the very ground beneath her feet. Kaelin. He had come. And a storm of fur and rage was about to break out that would change Wolf's Hollow forever. Chapter 13. Scars of the Heart. Kaelin burst into the clearing, a magnificent, terrifying figure in his shifted form. A massive timber wolf, his fur the color of midnight, his eyes blazing with golden fury. He was the embodiment of primal power, of untamed rage. He let out a roar that shook the trees, a challenge, a warning, a declaration of war. The sorceress turned, her icy eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing in anger. You, she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. You dare interfere? Kaelin didn't answer. He launched himself at the sorceress, a blur of fur and muscle, his claws extended, his fangs bared. The sorceress raised her hand, unleashing a blast of dark energy, but Kaelin dodged it with effortless grace, his movements too fast, too powerful to be contained. He slammed into her, knocking her off her feet, sending her sprawling onto the ground. He stood over her, his teeth inches from her throat, his growl a low, guttural rumble that promised pain and death. Evadne watched, her heart pounding in her chest, a mixture of fear and relief washing over her. Kaelin was here. He had come to protect her, to fight for her, to risk his life for hers. But the sorceress was not defeated. She rolled away from Kaelin's attack, scrambling to her feet, her eyes blazing with hatred. She raised her hands, chanting in the ancient language, summoning her power, preparing to strike back. Kaelin! Evadne cried, warning him. He turned, his gaze locking with hers for a brief moment. He saw the fear in her eyes, the love, the determination. He knew what he had to do. He turned back to the sorceress, his body tensing, preparing for another attack. But this time, the sorceress was ready. She unleashed a wave of dark energy, a powerful blast that struck Kaelin full force, throwing him backwards, slamming him against a tree. He fell to the ground, his body limp, his fur matted with blood. Evadne screamed, her heart breaking at the sight of him. Injured, vulnerable, possibly dead. The sorceress laughed, a triumphant, chilling sound that echoed through the clearing. You see? She said, her voice dripping with malice. He is no match for me. He is weak. He is pathetic. She turned her attention back to Evadne, her eyes filled with a cruel, predatory gleam. And now it's your turn, she said. It's time for the sacrifice. She raised her hand, preparing to deliver the final blow, the killing curse that would break the bond, that would end Evadne's life, that would unleash chaos and destruction upon Wolf's Hollow. But Evadne didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her gaze unwavering, her heart filled with a strange mixture of sorrow and peace. She had accepted her fate. She was ready. Do it, she said, her voice calm, resolute. End it. The sorceress hesitated, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. She sensed something, a change in Evadne, a power that she hadn't anticipated. She didn't understand it, but it made her uneasy. What are you doing? She hissed, her voice filled with uncertainty. Evadne smiled, a small, sad smile that held a hint of triumph. I'm doing what I should have done a long time ago, she said. I'm taking control. I'm choosing my own destiny. She closed her eyes, focusing on the ritual, on the words, on the power that flowed through her, the power of the moon, the power of the earth, the power of her love for Kaelin. She began to chant, her voice low and steady, the ancient language flowing from her lips, filling the clearing with a vibrant, pulsating energy. The air shimmered, the ground trembled, the moonlight intensified. The sorceress screamed, her body convulsing, her power waning. She tried to stop Evadne, to silence her, but it was too late. The ritual had begun. The counter curse was in motion. And then, with a final, desperate cry, the sorceress exploded in a blinding flash of light, her body disintegrating, her essence scattered to the winds. The clearing fell silent. The dark energy dissipated, the air cleared, the moonlight returned to its gentle glow. Evadne opened her eyes, her body trembling, her heart filled with a profound sense of relief. It was over. The sorceress was gone. The curse was broken. But her victory felt hollow. She looked around the clearing, her gaze searching for Kalen. She saw him, lying motionless against the tree, his body still, his eyes closed. She rushed to his side, her heart pounding with dread. "Kalen!" she cried, her voice filled with panic. "Kalen, wake up!" She knelt beside him, her hands gently touching his fur, her fingers searching for a pulse, for any sign of life. She found it. A faint, weak heartbeat, a shallow breath. He was alive, but he was badly injured. Tears streamed down her face, tears of relief, tears of sorrow, tears of guilt. He had risked his life for her. He had almost died. And it was all her fault. The scars of this night, she knew, would be more than just physical ones. Chapter 14. The Alpha's Claim. Evadne cradled Kalen's massive head in her lap, her fingers gently stroking his fur, tears streaming down her face. She could feel the shallow rise and fall of his chest, the faint beat of his heart, a fragile thread of life that she clung to desperately. She whispered his name, over and over again, a prayer, a plea, a desperate attempt to call him back from the brink of darkness. She didn't know how long she sat there, holding him, waiting for him to wake up. The moon began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, the first rays of dawn painting the sky with hues of pink and orange. The forest was awakening, the birds singing their morning songs, a stark contrast to the silence that had fallen over the clearing after the sorceress's demise. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Kalen stirred. He let out a low groan, his body trembling, his eyes slowly opening. He blinked, his golden gaze unfocused, confused. He saw Evadne, her face streaked with tears, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "Evadne?" he whispered, his voice weak, raspy. "I'm here," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm here, Kalen. You're safe." He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through his body, causing him to cry out. Evadne gently pushed him back down. "Don't move," she said. "You're injured." He looked around the clearing, his gaze taking in the devastation, the scattered remains of the altar, the lingering scent of magic. He remembered the fight, the sorceress, the blast of dark energy that had struck him. He remembered Evadne, standing her ground, chanting the ritual, her voice filled with power and determination. "The curse," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Is it broken?" Evadne nodded, tears welling up in her eyes again. "It's over," she said. "The sorceress is gone. The curse is broken." He closed his eyes, a wave of relief washing over him. He had done it. They had done it. They had survived. They had won. But the victory felt hollow, tainted by the pain, by the sacrifice, by the near loss. He looked at Evadne, at the woman he loved, the woman who had almost given her life to save him, to save the pack. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the sadness, the guilt. He reached out, his paw gently touching her cheek. He couldn't shift back yet, his body still too weak, too damaged. But he could communicate, through his touch, through his eyes, through the bond that connected them. "I love you," he said, his thoughts clear and strong in her mind. "Always and forever." She smiled, a small, sad smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I love you too, Kalen," she replied, her voice trembling. But he knew what she was thinking. The sacrifice. The ritual. The price that had been paid. He had almost lost her. And she had almost lost him. He nudged her hand with his head, urging her to help him shift. It was painful, excruciating, but he needed to hold her, to feel her in his arms, to reassure himself that she was real, that she was alive, that she was his. Slowly, painstakingly, he shifted back into his human form. He was naked, bruised, and covered in blood, but he didn't care. He reached for Evadne, pulling her close, holding her tight against his chest. She buried her face in his neck, her body trembling with sobs. He stroked her hair, her back, whispering words of comfort, of love, of reassurance. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "It's over. We're safe. We're together." They stayed there, in the clearing, as the sun rose, bathing them in its warm, golden light. They held each other, drawing strength from each other, healing each other, reaffirming their bond. Finally, when they had both calmed down, when the tears had dried, when the fear had subsided, Kaelin spoke. "We need to go back," he said. "The pack, they'll be worried." Evadne nodded, her head resting against his chest. She didn't want to move, didn't want to leave this moment, this sanctuary, this bubble of peace and love. But she knew he was right. They had responsibilities, duties, a pack to lead. They rose slowly, painfully, their bodies stiff and sore. Kaelin found a piece of fabric from the ruined altar, wrapping it around his waist. He helped Evadne to her feet, supporting her weight, his arm around her waist. They walked out of the clearing, hand in hand, their steps slow and deliberate. They walked towards the town, towards their home, towards their future. A future that was uncertain, but filled with hope. A future that they would face together. Always and forever. The claiming, as alpha, would need to be reasserted, before all, and soon. It was tradition. But right now, all Kaelin needed was to hold Evadne. Chapter 15. Broken Bonds and Bitter Truths. The return to Wolf's Hollow was met with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The pack had gathered in the square, their faces etched with worry, their eyes searching for any sign of their Alpha and Luna. When they saw Kaelin and Evadne emerge from the forest, a collective sigh of relief swept through the crowd. Cheers erupted, followed by a flurry of questions, concerns, and expressions of gratitude. Moira rushed forward, her emerald eyes filled with tears.
"Kaelin."
"Evadne," she exclaimed, embracing them both. "Thank the goddess you're alive. We were so worried." Kaelin managed a weak smile, his body still aching from the battle. "We're all right, Moira," he said. "Thanks to Evadne." She broke the curse. The pack murmured in awe, their gazes shifting to Evadne, their respect and admiration evident. She had saved them, not just from the sorceress, but from the ancient curse that had haunted them for generations. But amidst the celebration, Evadne felt a growing sense of unease. The relief of their survival was quickly being replaced by the realization of the challenges that lay ahead. The curse was broken, yes, but the bonds that had been strained, the relationships that had been tested, needed to be mended. And there was one bond in particular that weighed heavily on her heart. The bond with Kaelin. While they had shared a moment of intense connection in the clearing, a moment that reaffirmed their love and their commitment, Evadne couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. The years of separation, the trauma of the curse, the near-death experience, it had all taken its toll. As the days passed, Evadne noticed subtle changes in Kaelin. He was more withdrawn, more distant, spending hours in the council hall, poring over ancient texts, seemingly searching for answers to questions he wouldn't share. He was still affectionate, still loving, but there was a guardedness in his eyes, a hesitancy in his touch, that hadn't been there before. She tried to talk to him, to understand what he was going through, but he brushed her concerns aside, assuring her that he was fine, that he just needed time to process everything that had happened. But Evadne knew him too well. She knew he was hiding something, shielding her from a truth he didn't want her to face. One evening, she found him in the council hall, surrounded by stacks of books and scrolls, his face illuminated by the flickering candlelight. He looked exhausted, his eyes bloodshot, his shoulders slumped with weariness. "Kalen," she said softly, approaching him. "We need to talk." He looked up, his golden eyes meeting hers. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know," he said. But what?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What is it you're not telling me?" He hesitated, his gaze avoiding hers. He took a deep breath, then spoke, his voice low and heavy with a sorrow that cut Evadne to the core. "The ritual," he said. "The counter curse, it worked. It broke the sorceress's hold on us. But it had also changed things." Evadne's heart sank. She had known it, deep down, but hearing him say the words aloud was like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "The curse, it was bound to our souls," he explained. "It twisted our love, turned it into a weapon. The counter curse, it severed that connection. It freed us from the sorceress's influence. But it also weakened the bond between us." Evadne stared at him, her mind reeling. The soul bond, the unbreakable, undeniable connection that had drawn them together, that had sustained them through the years, it was weakened? What does that mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Are you saying you don't love me anymore?" He rushed to reassure her, his hands reaching out to grasp hers. "No," he exclaimed, his voice filled with panic. "No, Evadne, that's not what I'm saying. I love you, more than anything. But it's different now. The bond, it's not as strong. It's fragile." Tears welled up in Evadne's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. She understood now. The distance, the guardedness, the hesitancy, it wasn't a lack of love. It was a fear of loss. A fear of hurting her again. A fear of the fragility of their connection. The curse was broken, but so, in a way, were they. And Evadne wasn't sure if they could ever truly be whole again. The bitter truth was almost too much to bear, and yet, she had to. Chapter 16. The Ancient Enemy Unveiled. The revelation of the weakened bond hung heavy in the air, a suffocating silence that amplified the pain and uncertainty swirling between Evadne and Kalen. Evadne felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach, a fear that the love they had fought so hard to reclaim was slipping away, like sand through her fingers. "Fragile," she repeated, the word a bitter taste on her tongue. How fragile." Kalen looked away, unable to meet her gaze. He walked over to the window, staring out at the moonlit forest, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low and filled with a vulnerability that Evadne had rarely seen in him. "I can still feel the connection, the love, but it's like a faint echo, a whisper instead of a roar." He turned back to her, his golden eyes searching hers, pleading for understanding. "It's not that I love you any less, Evadne," he said. "It's that I'm afraid. Afraid of hurting you again. Afraid of losing you again. Afraid of this weakness between us." Evadne understood his fear. She felt it too. The thought of their bond, their once unbreakable connection, being so fragile, so vulnerable, was terrifying. But she also knew that they couldn't let fear consume them. They had to fight, to find a way to strengthen their bond, to rebuild what had been broken. "We can't give up, Kalen," she said, her voice firm, resolute. "We've come too far, fought too hard, to let this curse defeat us, even in its absence." He nodded, a flicker of hope returning to his eyes. "I know," he said. "But how? How do we strengthen a bond that's been severed?" He returned to the table, gesturing to the stacks of ancient texts. "I've been searching for answers," he said. "There has to be something, some ritual, some way to restore what we've lost." Evadne joined him, her gaze scanning the faded pages, the intricate symbols, the cryptic words. She had always had a gift for languages, for deciphering ancient texts, a skill that had been honed during her years on the run, researching the curse, searching for a way to break it. As she studied the texts, she noticed a recurring symbol, a complex pattern of interwoven lines and curves that seemed to be associated with the concept of soul bonds. It was a symbol she had seen before, fleetingly, in her fragmented memories, in the vision she had experienced in the underground pool. This symbol, she said, pointing to the intricate pattern. I've seen it before. It's connected to the soul bond, to the curse, and to something else. Kalen leaned closer, his brow furrowed in concentration. What else? He asked. Evadne closed her eyes, focusing on the memory, on the feeling, on the image that flickered at the edges of her consciousness. And then it came to her. The sorceress, she said, her voice filled with a sudden realization. It's connected to her origins, to her power. She opened her eyes, her gaze locking with Kalen's. I think this symbol is the key, she said. It's the key to understanding the curse, to strengthening our bond, and to defeating the true enemy. Kalen's eyes widened in surprise. The true enemy? He asked. What do you mean? The sorceress is gone. You destroyed her. Evadne shook her head. I destroyed her physical form, she said. But her essence, her power, it's still out there. And it's connected to something ancient, something powerful, something that predates even the curse itself. As she spoke, she remembered more details from the vision, fragments of information that had been hidden deep within her subconscious. She remembered the sorceress's origins, her lineage, her connection to an ancient race of beings of immense power, beings who had once ruled the world. The sorceress, she wasn't just a sorceress, Evadne said, her voice filled with awe and a growing sense of dread. She was a descendant of the Fae.
The Fae.
A whisper of legend, an ancient enemy thought long gone. And the one that had hunted them was just a single descendant. What power did the true, undiluted Fae possess? Chapter 17. A Dance with Darkness. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and ominous.
The Fae.
Creatures of myth and legend, beings of immense power and unpredictable nature, often associated with both beauty and cruelty. Evadne and Kalen had believed the sorceress to be their ultimate enemy, but now they realized she was merely a pawn, a descendant of a far more ancient and formidable foe. The Fae, Kalen repeated, the word a whisper filled with disbelief and a growing sense of unease. But they're just stories. Myths. Legends to frighten children. Evadne shook her head. They were real, Kalen, she said, her voice firm, resolute. And the sorceress, her power, her connection to that symbol, its proof. She was drawing on their power, channeling their energy, to fuel the curse. She pointed to the symbol in the ancient text, the intricate pattern of interwoven lines and curves. This isn't just a symbol of the soul bond, she said. It's a symbol of the Fae. It's a key to their realm, to their power, and to their weakness. Kalen studied the symbol, his brow furrowed in concentration. He had always been skeptical of the old tales, the stories of the Fae, dismissing them as folklore and superstition. But Evadne's conviction, her knowledge, her connection to the past, was undeniable. If the Fae are real, he said, his voice low and serious, and if the sorceress was drawing on their power, then what does that mean for us? For the pack? For the world? Evadne met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. It means we're facing a much greater threat than we ever imagined, she said. It means the curse was just the beginning. It means the Fae, they may be seeking to return. The thought of the Fae returning, of their ancient power being unleashed upon the world, was terrifying. They were beings of chaos and unpredictability, capable of both great beauty and unimaginable cruelty. They were not to be trifled with. We need to learn more, Kalen said, his voice filled with a newfound urgency. We need to understand their motives, their weaknesses, their plans. He began to search through the ancient texts, his fingers flying over the faded pages, his eyes scanning the cryptic words and symbols. Evadne joined him, her own knowledge of ancient languages and lore proving invaluable. They spent hours poring over the texts, piecing together fragments of information, uncovering hidden truths, slowly unraveling the mystery of the Fae and their connection to the curse. They discovered that the Fae had once ruled the world, their power unchallenged, their reign absolute. But they had been banished, driven back to their own realm by a coalition of humans and werewolves who had risen up against their tyranny. They learned that the Fae had always sought to return, to reclaim their lost dominion, to reassert their power over the human world. And they had used various means, various agents, to achieve their goals. The sorceress, she was just one of many. And they discovered that the symbol, the intricate pattern of interwoven lines and curves, was not just a key to their realm, but a gateway. A gateway that could be opened, a gateway that could allow the Fae to cross over into the human world. As they delved deeper into the ancient texts, they realized that the sorceress's plan had been far more ambitious than they had initially thought. She hadn't just been seeking to destroy Kaelin and Evadne, to break their bond. She had been seeking to open the gateway, to unleash the Fae upon the world. And she had almost succeeded. Evadne and Kaelin looked at each other, their eyes filled with a growing sense of dread. They had stopped the sorceress, but they hadn't stopped the Fae. The gateway was still out there, somewhere, waiting to be opened. "We have to find it," Evadne said, her voice firm, resolute. "We have to find the gateway, and we have to close it before it's too late." Kaelin nodded, his expression grim. He knew she was right. They had a new enemy, a far more dangerous enemy, and they had to act quickly, decisively, if they were to have any chance of stopping them. Their weakened bond, the fragility of their love, seemed insignificant now, compared to the threat they faced. They had to put their personal struggles aside, to focus on the greater good, to protect the pack, to protect the world from the return of the Fae. It would be a dance with darkness. A dance with an enemy more powerful than they could possibly imagine. But as they looked at one another, they were unified again, ready to fight for all they had lost and all they still had. Chapter 18. The Sacrifice of Love. The weight of their discovery settled upon them, a heavy burden of responsibility and fear. The Fae, an ancient and powerful enemy, were seeking to return, and Evadne and Kaelin were the only ones who knew the truth, the only ones who could stand in their way. The weakened bond between them, while still a source of pain and uncertainty, faded into the background as they focused on the task at hand, finding and closing the gateway. They spent days scouring the ancient texts, searching for any clue, any hint, as to the location of the gateway. They consulted with Moira and the elder members of the pack, drawing on their collective knowledge of lore and legend. They explored the forest, the surrounding mountains, the hidden caves and ancient ruins, searching for any sign of Fae influence, any indication of a portal between worlds. But the gateway remained elusive, hidden, protected by ancient magic and guarded by forces unknown. Time was running out. They could feel the Fae's presence growing stronger, a subtle shift in the energy of the world, a growing sense of unease and anticipation. One evening, as they were poring over a particularly cryptic passage in an ancient scroll, Evadne had a breakthrough. She noticed a series of symbols, a sequence of runes, that seemed to correspond to a specific location, a place deep within the forest, a place known as the Whispering Falls. I think I found it," she said, her voice filled with excitement and a touch of trepidation. The Whispering Falls. It's a place of power, a place where the veil between worlds is thin. The symbols, they matched the description in the text. Kaelin leaned closer, his eyes scanning the symbols, his brow furrowed in concentration. He recognized the runes, the ancient language of the Fae, a language he had only encountered in the most obscure and forbidden texts. The Whispering Falls, he repeated, the name sending a shiver down his spine. He had heard stories about the place, tales of strange occurrences, of unexplained phenomena, of a power that both attracted and repelled. It was a place the pack avoided, a place shrouded in mystery and danger. "It's a risk," he said, his voice low and serious. "But it's our best lead. We have to go there." They prepared for their journey, gathering supplies, weapons, and protective charms. They knew they were walking into a trap, that the Fae would be waiting for them, that the gateway would be heavily guarded. But they had no choice. They had to face the danger, to confront the enemy, to protect the world from the return of the Fae. As they set out for the Whispering Falls, Evadne couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. She knew this was more than just a dangerous mission. It was a turning point, a moment of reckoning, a test of their strength, their courage, and their love. They reached the Whispering Falls as the sun began to set, the sky ablaze with hues of orange and purple. The falls were a breathtaking sight, a cascade of water plunging down a sheer cliff face, creating a mist that shimmered in the fading light. The air here was thick with magic, with a sense of ancient power, with the whispering voices of the Fae. They found the gateway hidden behind the falls, a shimmering portal of energy, barely visible to the naked eye. It was guarded by two figures, tall and imposing, their features obscured by shadows, their eyes glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. They were Fae warriors, guardians of the gateway, ready to defend it against any intruders. A battle ensued, a fierce and brutal clash of magic and steel. Kaelin and Evadne fought with all their strength, all their skill, all their courage, but the Fae warriors were powerful, their attacks relentless, their defenses impenetrable. As the battle raged, Evadne realized that they were losing. They were outmatched, outnumbered, outpowered. The Fae were too strong, the gateway too well protected. They couldn't win. And then she remembered the ritual, the counter curse, the sacrifice. She had broken the sorceress's curse by offering herself as a sacrifice, by willingly giving up her life to save Kaelin and the pack. But the true curse, the threat of the Fae, remained. And it required a different kind of sacrifice. It required the sacrifice of love. She looked at Kaelin, fighting fiercely beside her, his body bruised and battered, his spirit unbroken. She saw the love in his eyes, the unwavering devotion, the bond that connected them, even in its weakened state. She knew what she had to do. She stepped in front of Kaelin, shielding him from a blast of Fae energy. She raised her hands, chanting the words of a different ritual, a ritual of severing, a ritual of separation, a ritual of sacrifice. She was not sacrificing her life. She was sacrificing their bond, their love, their connection. She was breaking the weakened soul bond completely and irrevocably to sever the connection to the Fae, to close the gateway, to protect the world from their return. As she chanted, she felt the bond between them unravel, the connection weaken, the love fade. It was the most agonizing pain she had ever experienced, a tearing, a ripping, a shattering of her soul. Kaelin cried out, his voice filled with anguish and disbelief. He understood what she was doing. He tried to stop her, but it was too late. The ritual was complete. The bond was broken. The gateway closed. The Fae warriors vanished. And Evadne and Kaelin were left standing there, alone, separated, their love a sacrifice to save the world. He stared at her, through tears, not understanding.
Why?
It was a single word, filled with the depth of his grief. Chapter 19. Reclaiming the Lost. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the roar of the Whispering Falls and Kaelin's anguished cry. Evadne stood there, her body trembling, her heart shattered, her soul aching with the loss of the bond, the love, the connection that had defined her existence for so long.
Why?
Kaelin repeated, his voice a raw, broken whisper. He stumbled towards her, his hands reaching out, then falling limply to his sides. He couldn't touch her. Not anymore. The invisible barrier between them was palpable, a cold, empty space where their bond had once resided. Evadne met his gaze, her eyes filled with tears, her voice choked with emotion. It was the only way, she said, her voice barely audible above the roar of the falls. To close the gateway. To stop the Fae. To save everyone. He shook his head, his eyes filled with disbelief and a growing sense of despair. But our bond, he said. Our love, it's gone. You destroyed it. She closed her eyes, the pain of his words like a physical blow. It was already weakened, Kaelin, she said. The sorceress's curse had damaged it. The ritual had just finished what she started. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze again, her heart aching for his pain, for his loss. But it was the only way, she repeated. To sever the connection to the Fae. To protect the world. To protect you. He stared at her, his eyes searching hers, seeking some sign of the woman he loved, the woman he had shared his life with, the woman who had been his soulmate. But he found only a stranger, a woman who had made a choice, a sacrifice, that he couldn't understand, that he couldn't forgive. He turned away from her, his shoulders slumping with defeat. He walked towards the edge of the cliff, staring out at the cascading water, the mist rising around him like a shroud. Evadne watched him, her heart breaking. She had saved the world, but she had lost everything that mattered. She had lost her love, her bond, her connection to the man who had been her everything. She wanted to go to him, to comfort him, to explain, to beg for his forgiveness. But she knew it was useless. The bond was gone. The connection was severed. They were strangers now, separated by a chasm of pain and loss. She turned and walked away, leaving him alone with his grief, with his anger, with his despair. She walked back towards Wolf's Hollow, her steps slow and heavy, her heart filled with a profound sense of emptiness. As she walked, she began to question her decision. Had she done the right thing? Had the sacrifice been worth it? Had she saved the world, only to destroy her own? She reached Wolf's Hollow, the town quiet and peaceful, unaware of the battle that had been fought, of the sacrifice that had been made. She saw the faces of the pack, their eyes filled with gratitude and respect, but she felt nothing. She was numb, empty, lost. She went to her room, the room that had once been theirs, the room that now felt cold and empty. She sat on the bed, staring at the empty space beside her, the space where Kaelin should have been. She picked up the silver ring, the ring that had once been a symbol of their bond, of their love, of their connection. It was just a piece of metal now, cold and lifeless, devoid of any meaning. She slipped it off her finger, placing it on the bedside table. She couldn't wear it anymore. It was a reminder of what she had lost, of what she had sacrificed, of what she could never have again. She lay down on the bed, curling up in a ball, her body trembling with sobs. She cried for the loss of her love, for the loss of her bond, for the loss of her future. She cried for Kaelin. But even as she cried, a tiny spark of hope flickered within her. She had made a sacrifice, a terrible sacrifice, but she had done it for a reason. She had done it to protect the world, to protect the pack, to protect the man she loved. And maybe, just maybe, that sacrifice would not be in vain. Maybe someday, somehow, they could find a way to rebuild, to reconnect, to reclaim what had been lost. Maybe love, true love, could find a way to transcend even the greatest of sacrifices. Maybe. The possibility was all she had left to cling to.
And so she did.
Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Evadne and Kaelin lived in the same town, shared the same space, but they were worlds apart. The broken bond, the sacrifice of their love, had created an unbridgeable chasm between them. They spoke when necessary, their interactions polite but distant, their eyes carefully avoiding each other, the unspoken pain and regret hanging heavy in the air. Kaelin threw himself into his duties as alpha, leading the pack, protecting them from any potential threats, burying himself in work to avoid the emptiness that consumed him. He was a shell of his former self, his golden eyes dimmed, his laughter gone, his spirit broken. Evadne, too, struggled to adapt to her new reality. She spent her days wandering the forest, seeking solace in nature, trying to find some semblance of peace, some meaning in her sacrifice. She helped the pack where she could, using her knowledge of ancient lore and languages, but her heart wasn't in it. She was a ghost, haunting the edges of her former life, unable to move on, unable to forget. The pack watched them, their hearts aching for their Alpha and Luna, their leaders, their friends. They understood the sacrifice that had been made, the necessity of breaking the bond to save them all, but they couldn't bear to see the pain, the separation, the loss that had consumed Evadne and Kaelin. Moira, Ever the wise and compassionate Beta tried to intervene, to mediate, to find a way to bridge the gap between them. But her efforts were in vain. The wound was too deep, the pain too raw, the loss too profound. One evening, as the full moon cast its silvery glow over Wolf's Hollow, Evadne found herself drawn to the clearing, the place where the curse had been broken, the place where their bond had been severed. She stood there alone, beneath the ancient oak, the memories of that fateful night flooding back, the pain of the sacrifice as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. She closed her eyes, letting the tears flow freely, grieving for the loss of her love, for the loss of her connection to Kaelin, for the loss of the future they had dreamed of. As she stood there, she heard a sound, a familiar footstep, a presence that she had once known intimately, but which now felt foreign, distant. She opened her eyes and saw him. Kaelin stood at the edge of the clearing, his gaze fixed on her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain, regret, and something else. Something that Evadne couldn't quite decipher. They stared at each other, the silence stretching between them, thick and heavy with unspoken emotions. The full moon bathed them in its silvery light, illuminating the chasm that separated them, the invisible barrier that had been erected by the sacrifice of their love. Finally, Kaelin spoke, his voice low and hoarse. "I miss you," he said. The words, simple and heartfelt, pierced Evadne's heart like a knife. She had missed him too, every moment of every day, with every fiber of her being. "I miss you too, Kaelin," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He took a step closer, then hesitated, his body trembling with the effort to overcome the invisible barrier between them. He couldn't cross it. Not yet. I don't understand, he said, his voice filled with confusion and pain. "Why did you do it, Evadne? Why did you break the bond? Why did you destroy us?" She met his gaze, her eyes filled with tears, but also with a newfound strength, a clarity that had come from months of reflection, of grieving, of acceptance. "I did it to save you," she said, her voice firm, resolute. "To save the pack. To save the world. The Fae, they were using our bond, our love, as a weapon. It was the only way to stop them." He shook his head, his eyes filled with a desperate plea for understanding. "But there had to be another way," he said. "We could have found another way. Together." Evadne sighed, her shoulders slumping with the weight of her decision, of the sacrifice she had made. "Maybe," she said. "But we didn't have time, Kaelin. The gateway was opening. The Fae were coming. I had to act quickly. I had to make a choice." She stepped closer to him, her gaze unwavering. "And I chose to save you," she said. "Even if it meant losing you. Even if it meant breaking my own heart." Kaelin stared at her, his eyes searching hers, finally seeing the truth, the depth of her love, the magnitude of her sacrifice. He saw the pain she had endured, the courage she had shown, the selfless act that had saved them all. He understood. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her cheek, his fingers trembling. He couldn't touch her, not physically, but he could connect with her, through his eyes, through his heart, through the lingering embers of the love that still burned within him. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry, Evadne. For doubting you. For blaming you. For not understanding." She smiled, a small, sad smile that held a hint of hope. "It's okay, Kaelin," she said. "I understand. It was a lot to process." They stood there in the moonlight, the chasm between them still present, but no longer insurmountable. They had faced the truth, the pain, the loss. They had acknowledged the sacrifice, the broken bond, the shattered dreams. But they had also found something else. A new understanding, a new respect, a new appreciation for the love that had once bound them together, and which, perhaps, could still find a way to heal, to reconnect, to rebuild. The bond was gone, but the love remained. A different kind of love, perhaps. A love born of sacrifice, of loss, of understanding. A love that was fragile, yes, but also resilient, enduring, and, ultimately, unbreakable. Not in a magical sense, but a deeper, more human way. It was a beginning. Epilogue. The years that followed were not easy. The absence of the soul bond left a void, a constant ache of something missing, a reminder of the love that had been sacrificed. Evadne and Kaelin had to learn to navigate their relationship anew, to build a connection based not on magic, but on shared history, mutual respect, and a deep, abiding affection that transcended the supernatural. They started slowly, cautiously, like two strangers learning to trust each other, to open their hearts to the possibility of a different kind of love. They spent hours talking, sharing their thoughts, their feelings, their fears, their hopes. They rediscovered each other, not as mates bound by an ancient magic, but as two individuals who had shared a profound experience, a traumatic loss, and a courageous victory. They learned to communicate without the ease of the bond, to rely on words, on gestures, on unspoken understanding. They learned to appreciate the small moments, the shared smiles, the gentle touches, the quiet evenings spent together by the fire. They found solace in their work, in their dedication to the pack, in their commitment to protecting the world from any future threats. They worked side by side, their strengths complementing each other, their wisdom and experience guiding them through the challenges that arose. The pack, witnessing their slow, painstaking journey of healing and reconnection, offered their unwavering support, their understanding, their love. They saw the strength in Evadne and Kaelin, the resilience, the determination to rebuild their relationship, to create a new kind of bond, a bond forged not in magic, but in shared experience, mutual respect, and enduring affection. And slowly, gradually, the chasm between them began to close. The pain of the sacrifice lessened, the memories of the lost bond faded, replaced by a new appreciation for the love that remained, the love that had endured, the love that had evolved. They never fully regained what they had lost. The soul bond was gone forever. But they found something else, something perhaps even more profound. A love that was chosen, not fated. A love that was earned, not given. A love that was built on a foundation of trust, respect, and a shared commitment to each other, to the pack, to the world. One evening, many years later, as the full moon cast its silvery glow over Wolf's Hollow, Evadne and Kaelin stood together in the clearing, the place where their journey had begun, the place where their love had been tested, the place where their future had been forged. They were older now, their hair streaked with silver, their faces lined with the marks of time and experience. But their eyes still shone with a love that had endured, a love that had transformed, a love that had ultimately triumphed. Kaelin reached out, his hand gently touching Evadne's cheek. He could touch her now, without hesitation, without fear. The physical connection, while not as intense as it had once been, was still there, a comforting warmth, a familiar presence. "I love you, Evadne," he said, his voice filled with a depth of emotion that transcended words. She smiled, her eyes sparkling with tears of joy, of gratitude, of love. "I love you too, Kaelin," she said. And as they stood there, bathed in the moonlight, surrounded by the whispering trees, the spirits of the forest, and the love of their pack, they knew that they had found their way back to each other. Not as they were before, but as they were meant to be. Two souls, connected not by magic, but by choice. Two hearts, beating as one, in a love that was stronger, deeper, and more enduring than any curse, any sacrifice, any loss. Their new life together, a tapestry woven from the threads of the past, and full of the hope of what was to come.